I want to tell you about something that's happening right now in December 2025 that should terrify strategic planners at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Turkey, a member of the Atlantic Alliance for over 70 years, controlling some of the most strategic territory on Earth, commanding NATO's second largest military, is systematically deepening its relationships with Russia and China in ways that fundamentally compromise the alliance's security architecture. This isn't about occasional diplomatic friction or disagreements over policy. This is about a NATO member state deliberately building strategic partnerships with the two countries that NATO identifies as its primary threats. And the depth of these relationships, military, economic, technological, political, is creating vulnerabilities in the alliance that may be irreparable. Let me walk you through what's actually happening, because the scale of Turkey's reorientation is something most people in the West don't fully comprehend. Start with Russia, because this is the relationship that most directly threatens NATO's operational integrity. In 2017, Turkey made a decision that should have triggered alarm bells across the alliance. They signed a deal to purchase Russia's S-400 air defense system. This wasn't just buying weapons from a geopolitical rival. This was integrating Russian military technology into the defenses of a NATO member state. The S-400 is one of Russia's most advanced systems. It's designed to shoot down NATO aircraft. It operates on frequencies and uses radars that can potentially gather intelligence on NATO planes, including the F-35 stealth fighter. When Turkey activated the S-400 system in 2019 and continued operating it through 2025, they created a situation where Russian technicians and military personnel regularly visit Turkish soil to maintain and upgrade the systems. Think about what this means operationally. Russian military personnel have access to NATO member territory. They can observe NATO exercises. The S-400 radars, when active, can collect data on NATO aircraft operating in the region. This intelligence flows back to Moscow. NATO operational security is compromised by one of its own members. The United States expelled Turkey from the F-35 program because of this. Turkey was both a buyer and a production partner, manufacturing components for the aircraft. That partnership ended. But Turkey didn't reverse course. They didn't choose NATO over Russia. Instead, by December 2025, Turkey has not only kept the S-400, but has discussed purchasing additional batteries and potentially co-producing components in Turkey. The military relationship goes beyond air defense. Turkey has purchased Russian military helicopters. There are discussions about acquiring Russian fighter jets to potentially replace aging F-16s if American sales remain blocked or delayed. Turkish and Russian defense companies are exploring joint production agreements. Naval coordination is developing in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Russian and Turkish warships conduct joint exercises in the Black Sea. In 2024 and 2025, these weren't just symbolic patrols. They were substantive exercises practicing anti-submarine warfare, air defense coordination, and maritime interdiction. These are capabilities that could theoretically be used against NATO forces. Turkey controls the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the only waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The 1936 Montreux Convention gives Turkey enormous discretion over military vessel passage. As Turkey's relationship with Russia deepens, NATO has to consider whether Turkey might use this choke point in ways that favor Russian interests. Could Turkey restrict NATO warship access to the Black Sea while facilitating Russian passage? In a crisis scenario, this becomes a critical vulnerability. The economic integration with Russia creates structural dependencies that give Moscow leverage. Turkey imports approximately 45% of its natural gas from Russia, primarily through the Turk Stream pipeline. That's not just a commercial relationship, it's energy dependence that Moscow can exploit. When European countries tried to reduce Russian energy dependence after the Ukraine invasion in 2022, Turkey increased imports. Turkey's first nuclear power plant at Akuyu is being built by Russia's Rosatom in a $20 billion project. Russia is financing the construction and will operate the facility. When fully operational, it will provide roughly 10% of Turkey's electricity. Russia will control a significant portion of Turkish power generation for the next 40 to 50 years. This gives Moscow leverage that extends decades into the future. Bilateral trade between Russia and Turkey exceeded $62 billion in 2022 and has remained substantial despite international pressure. Russian tourists are Turkey's largest source of tourism revenue, over 5 million Russian visitors annually, bringing approximately $7 billion into the Turkish economy. Turkish construction companies work on major projects in Russia. Turkish agricultural products flow to Russian markets. This economic interdependence creates a situation where Turkey's economic stability is partially tied to maintaining good relations with Moscow. When the West imposes sanctions on Russia, Turkey faces pressure to comply, but compliance would severely damage the Turkish economy. So Turkey finds ways around sanctions, becoming a conduit for Russian trade that Western sanctions tried to cut off. Now add China to the equation, because Turkey's pivot isn't just toward Moscow, it's toward both of America's primary geopolitical rivals simultaneously. China has become Turkey's second largest source of imports and a major trading partner, with bilateral trade reaching approximately $50 billion by 2024. But it's not just the volume, it's the sectors where Chinese engagement is growing that should concern NATO. Chinese technology companies are deeply embedded in Turkey's infrastructure. Huawei has been a major player in building Turkey's telecommunications networks, including components of its 5G infrastructure. Despite American pressure to exclude Huawei over security concerns, Turkey has allowed Chinese companies significant access to its digital infrastructure. Think about what this means. Telecommunications networks carry government communications, military data, commercial secrets, and personal information. If Chinese companies build and potentially maintain access to these networks, they create intelligence vulnerabilities that compromise NATO operations conducted through or coordinated with Turkey. Turkish defense companies are exploring cooperation with Chinese firms. There have been discussions about joint drone development, radar systems, and missile technology. While Turkey's defense industry has traditionally been oriented toward NATO standards and Turkish companies produce components for NATO systems, the growing Chinese relationship creates potential for technology leakage. China is investing heavily in Turkish infrastructure through Belt and Road Initiative projects. Chinese companies are involved in port development, transportation networks, and energy projects. The more Chinese investment is woven into Turkish infrastructure, the more leverage Beijing gains over Ankara's policy decisions. Turkish financial institutions are developing deeper ties with Chinese banks. There are currency swap agreements allowing trade in yuan and lira, reducing dependence on dollars. As Turkey faces chronic currency instability and inflation, Chinese financial support becomes more valuable and more leveraging. President Erdogan has made multiple state visits to both Beijing and Moscow in recent years, often coordinating positions on international issues. At the United Nations and other international forums, Turkey increasingly votes in alignment with Russia and China rather than with NATO allies on issues ranging from human rights to Syria to Ukraine. On Ukraine specifically, the defining European security crisis since World War II, Turkey has refused to join Western sanctions against Russia. Turkey has maintained trade relations, kept airspace open to Russian flights when European airspace closed, and positioned itself as a mediator rather than aligning with NATO's position. Erdogan has met repeatedly with Putin, even as other NATO leaders treat Russia as a pariah state. Now, let me tell you why Turkey is making these choices, because understanding Turkish motivations is essential to grasping why this trend will likely continue. First, perceived betrayal by the United States. Turkey believes America armed and trained Kurdish YPG forces in Syria that Ankara views as indistinguishable from the PKK, a designated terrorist organization that has fought the Turkish state for decades. From Turkey's perspective, the U.S. supported groups that pose an existential threat to Turkish territorial integrity. That created deep resentment. Second, the failed coup attempt in July 2016. Turkey believes, with varying levels of evidence, that the coup had Western connections or that the West's response was insufficiently supportive of Turkey's elected government. The fact that Fethullah Gulen, blamed by Turkey for orchestrating the coup, lived in the United States and wasn't extradited despite Turkish demands convinced many Turks of American hostility. Russia, by contrast, immediately and vocally supported Erdogan during and after the coup. Putin called Erdogan directly to express support. That created a sense of debt and demonstrated that Moscow could be a reliable partner when Washington seemed ambivalent. Third, economic necessity. Turkey's economy has faced severe challenges: currency crises, high inflation exceeding 60% at points, unemployment. Western financial institutions like the IMF offer assistance, but with conditions: central bank independence, structural reforms, fiscal austerity that Erdogan finds politically unacceptable. Russia and China offer economic support without political conditions. For an increasingly authoritarian leader, that's far more attractive. Fourth, regional ambitions. Erdogan envisions Turkey as a major regional power, not just a NATO member following American leadership. He wants influence in the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Achieving those ambitions often requires working with or through Russia and China, not against them. Exclusive alignment with NATO constrains Turkey's ability to pursue independent regional policies. Fifth, ideological affinity. Erdogan's Turkey has moved away from secular democracy toward a more authoritarian, Islamist-tinged system. This creates ideological distance from Western liberal democracies and some affinity with Russia's anti-Western conservatism and China's authoritarian governance model. All three countries position themselves as alternatives to Western liberal hegemony. Sixth, the perception that American power is declining and that China is rising. Turkey is hedging. If the future of global power is multipolar rather than American-dominated, exclusive alignment with Washington seems strategically unwise. Better to maintain NATO membership for its benefits while building relationships with rising powers. The implications for NATO are severe and becoming more apparent by December 2025. Operational security is fundamentally compromised. NATO cannot share sensitive intelligence with Turkey without assuming it may reach Moscow or Beijing. NATO cannot plan operations in the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Middle East without considering that Turkey might inform adversaries. This creates a situation where one member cannot be fully trusted, which undermines the entire concept of collective defense. Strategic geography is at risk. Turkey controls the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Turkey borders Syria, Iraq, Iran, and is close to the Caucasus. Turkey hosts Incirlik Air Base, which has been crucial for U.S. operations in the Middle East. If Turkey's alignment continues shifting, NATO loses guaranteed access to all of this. Incirlik could be closed to American use. The straits could be managed in ways that favor Russian interest. Turkish territory could become unavailable for NATO operations. The alliance's southern flank becomes unreliable. NATO's deterrence posture assumes all members will respond to threats or attacks on any member under Article 5. But if Turkey's interests are increasingly aligned with Russia and China, would Ankara actually support NATO action against Russian aggression in the Baltics? Would Turkey block NATO decisions? The uncertainty itself undermines deterrence. Military interoperability is degrading. As Turkey integrates Russian weapon systems like the S-400, as Turkish and Russian forces conduct joint exercises, as Turkish defense industry explores cooperation with China, Turkey's military becomes less interoperable with NATO standards. The ability to operate seamlessly with other NATO forces, essential to alliance effectiveness, erodes. The precedent for other members becomes dangerous. If Turkey can maintain NATO membership while deepening ties with Russia and China, what's stopping Hungary from doing the same, or other members facing domestic political pressures or economic inducements? Turkey's example normalizes hedging strategies that fracture alliance cohesion. So what can NATO do about this? The options are extremely limited and all carry significant risks. Expelling Turkey from NATO would require unanimous consent from all members, which is unlikely. It would also hand Turkey completely to Russia and China, making the strategic situation worse, not better. Turkey outside NATO, fully aligned with Moscow and Beijing, creates a larger problem than Turkey inside NATO, but unreliable. Economic sanctions on Turkey would accelerate Ankara's pivot toward Russia and China while damaging European economic interests. Turkey is a major trade partner for EU countries. Sanctions might satisfy a desire to punish Turkish behavior, but would likely backfire strategically. Military confrontation is obviously unthinkable. NATO going to war with one of its own members would destroy the alliance instantly. Diplomatic engagement has been tried repeatedly and failed to change Turkey's trajectory. Appeals to alliance solidarity, warnings about consequences, offers of alternative weapon systems, none have convinced Turkey to reverse its deepening ties with Russia and China. The United States has used some targeted measures, expelling Turkey from F-35 program, threatening sanctions under CAATSA legislation for the S-400 purchase, restricting some arms sales. But these actions haven't changed Turkish behavior and may have reinforced Ankara's conviction that Washington is unreliable and that diversifying partnerships is necessary. So NATO is essentially paralyzed, watching a member state drift toward adversaries without effective tools to prevent it. And Ankara knows this. Turkey has leverage precisely because its geography is irreplaceable and because expelling Turkey would be worse than tolerating its divided loyalties. Russia and China are playing this situation masterfully. They don't need Turkey to leave NATO. Turkey inside NATO, but aligned with Russian and Chinese interests, is far more valuable than Turkey outside NATO. It creates confusion, dysfunction, and distrust within the alliance. It compromises NATO intelligence and planning. It demonstrates that even formal treaty allies can be pulled toward Moscow and Beijing through patient cultivation of economic dependence and political alignment. Here's what deeply troubles me about where we are in December 2025. This isn't a temporary problem that time will solve. The infrastructure connecting Turkey to Russia and China, pipelines, nuclear plants, trade relationships, military cooperation, is being built for decades. The economic dependencies are structural. The political alignment is becoming normalized. Every year that passes, Turkey becomes more integrated with Russia and China and less interoperable with NATO. Every year, the cost of reversing course increases for Turkey. They'd have to abandon economic relationships, strand infrastructure investments, and reverse foreign policy orientation. That becomes less likely over time, not more. We're watching NATO's most strategically important member after the United States systematically align with the alliance's primary adversaries. And we have no effective strategy to prevent it because the strategic situation we've created leaves Turkey with strong incentives to continue current policies and weak incentives to reverse course. This is what strategic failure looks like, not dramatic military defeat, but slow erosion of alliance cohesion, reliability, and effectiveness. NATO was built to deter Soviet aggression through collective defense. It succeeded brilliantly for 70 years. Now, one of its core members is coordinating with the Soviet successor state and with the rising power that challenges Western dominance. The question isn't whether Turkey's deepening ties with Moscow and Beijing will continue. The trajectory is clear. The question is whether NATO can remain effective with a member that's simultaneously part of the alliance and increasingly aligned with its adversaries. I don't have good answers, but I know this: pretending the problem doesn't exist, hoping Turkey will come back into the fold on its own, treating this as temporary diplomatic friction, all of that is denial. Turkey's geopolitical turn is real, it's deepening, and it leaves NATO seriously exposed in ways the alliance has never faced. We built NATO to contain Soviet power. We assumed Turkey would always be on our side because history and geography made it inevitable. We were wrong. Strategic alignments can shift. And in December 2025, we're living with the consequences of a NATO member choosing Moscow and Beijing over Washington and Brussels. The alliance is being tested from within, and right now it's failing that test. The question is whether we'll recognize the problem in time to adapt, or whether we'll watch NATO hollow out from the inside while we focus on external threats, not realizing that the most serious vulnerability is sitting at the table with us. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double check responses.